My grandmother died, she left me her bakery. Not the building. She didn't own that. She left me the equipment inside it, the lease she'd been paying on for 31 years, and a handwritten note tucked underneath the cash register that said, "This is yours if you want it. Don't let anyone tell you what it's worth." My brother got the house. Not the falling apart ranch house my grandmother had actually lived in, which my mother sold 2 weeks after the funeral without telling me. He got the actual house, a 3-bedroom colonial in Asheville that my grandmother had bought as an investment property in the 90s and had been renting out ever since. According to my mother, it was the fair thing. The bakery had sentimental value. The house had real value. I was 26 years old, working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm in Charlotte, making decent money but nothing that was going to change my life. My brother was 30, living off a trust fund from our grandfather's side that he'd already burned through once and been quietly replenished by my parents. He had never held a job for longer than 8 months. When I walked into my grandmother's bakery for the first time as its new owner, if you could even call me that, with nothing but a lease and a pile of rusted equipment, I sat down on the floor and cried. Not because I was grateful, because I didn't know what I was going to do. The place was called Mabel's. It had been named after my grandmother, and it sat on a corner lot in a part of Asheville that used to be overlooked and was just starting not to be. The neighborhood had a name that people in real estate were beginning to say with a certain kind of emphasis. There was a craft brewery 2 blocks away. A record store had opened across the street. The bones were there. What was also there, a convection oven from 1987 that made a sound like a small aircraft when it warmed up, a walk-in refrigerator that kept everything at exactly 47 degrees, which is too warm for dairy and too cold for produce. A display case with a crack in the glass held together by a strip of clear packing tape my grandmother had applied and never replaced. A loyal customer base of about 40 people, most of them in their 70s, who came in every morning for coffee and a slice of whatever my grandmother had made the night before. I took 3 days off work, drove up to Asheville, and sat in that bakery for all 3 of them. I talked to the customers. I talked to my grandmother's one employee, a woman named Dot, who had been working there for 11 years and who told me, very plainly, that she planned to retire in 2 years and that she'd stay until then if I needed her. I walked every inch of the space. I looked at the lease. I looked at the equipment. I looked at the neighborhood. Then I drove back to Charlotte, gave notice at my job, and started figuring out what I was doing. I want to be clear about something. Nobody supported this decision. My mother thought I had lost my mind. My father, who had been largely absent from my life since the divorce, but who still felt entitled to opinions about it, called me on a Tuesday evening to say he'd heard what I was doing and that it was a bad financial move. My brother sent me a voice note. He couldn't even be bothered to call, saying that I should think about selling the equipment and subletting the space, because the neighborhood was probably not going to pop the way people think. This from the man who had just received a 3-bedroom house as a gift. I didn't argue with any of them. I thanked my father for his concern, did not respond to my brother's voice note, and told my mother I would keep her updated. Then I spent the next 4 months learning everything I did not know about running a bakery. I took an intensive pastry course in Charleston. 2 weeks cost me $4,000, which I put on a credit card and paid off over 8 months. I found a small business development center attached to the local community college and started meeting with a counselor there, a retired restaurant owner named Frank, who had seen 100 people walk in with exactly the kind of hope I had and who did not let me keep any illusions that weren't useful. Frank told me to get my books in order before I did anything else. Frank told me the first year was going to be harder than I thought. Frank was right about everything. I moved to Asheville in January. I slept on an air mattress in my grandmother's old apartment for 2 months because I couldn't afford anything else. I was at the bakery by 4 every morning. I learned to bake, really bake, not the kind of thing you do on a Sunday afternoon, but the kind that requires understanding ratios and humidity and the particular personality of your oven, which in my case had the personality of a difficult elderly relative who only cooperated when approached with patience. By March, I had updated the menu. By April, I had introduced weekend brunch service and hired a part-time counter person. By June, one of the food blogs that covers Asheville's restaurant scene posted a write-up that described my cardamom morning buns as the reason to wake up. By August, I had a line out the door on Saturday mornings. I did not call my family to tell them any of this. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was too busy. The first time my mother came to visit, it was October, and she stood in the middle of the bakery on a Saturday morning and watched the line, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have liked this." I thought she meant it as a compliment. I should have understood it as something else. By the following spring, I had paid off my credit card, renegotiated the lease to a longer term at a better rate, replaced the walk-in refrigerator, and put a new convection oven on a payment plan. I had hired 2 more employees. I had started doing wholesale. A local coffee shop bought my scones, and a boutique hotel in the River Arts District ordered pastry boxes for their weekend guests. My revenue for year 1 was just under $200,000. Not profit, revenue. After expenses, I cleared about $38,000, which was less than I'd made at my old job. But I owned something now. I was building something. Frank, at our check-in meeting that spring, told me I was ahead of where most people were at this stage. He told me to keep my costs tight, keep building the wholesale side, and think about whether there was a second revenue stream I could add without overextending. He told me the neighborhood was going to keep developing and that I should be thinking about what that meant for the lease in 3 years. I started thinking about catering. Asheville is a wedding town. It is also a bachelorette party town, a corporate retreat town, a we drove up from Charlotte for the weekend town. There is a constant market for beautiful food at events. And the bakeries and caterers who served it were either too expensive for most clients or not good enough for the ones who could afford more. I saw the gap. I spent 6 months building out the catering side carefully. I developed a menu. I did 3 events at cost, basically for free, to build a portfolio. I hired a part-time events coordinator named Val, who had worked in hospitality for 10 years and knew every venue manager in the county. By the end of my 2nd year, catering was 30% of my revenue. By the middle of my 3rd year, I had outgrown the space. I had been in conversation with my landlord about expansion. There was a unit adjacent to mine that had been a hair salon and had been sitting empty for a year. We negotiated for several months. I got a small business loan, my first real one, from a local credit union that had a program specifically for women business owners. I gutted the adjacent space, opened up the wall between them, and built a proper event and catering prep area. The expanded bakery opened in September of my 3rd year. I had a write-up in the Asheville Citizen-Times. A food writer from a regional magazine came and stayed for 2 hours and asked me about my grandmother. My revenue that year crossed $600,000. My profit was just over $90,000. I still had not told my family the specifics. My mother knew the bakery was doing well. She had visited a few times. She followed the Instagram account. But I had learned, through those early months, that sharing financial details with my family produced a particular kind of attention that I didn't want, so I kept things vague. It's going okay. We're growing. I'm really happy with where things are. That was my mistake. It was a Sunday in November, 3.5 years after I had sat on the floor of that bakery and cried, when my mother called me and asked if she could come visit that week. She had something she wanted to talk to me about. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. I made coffee. We sat at one of the tables in the bakery after closing, the chairs still up on most of the surfaces, the smell of the day's baking still in the air. I thought she was going to tell me something about her health, or about my father, or about something administrative related to my grandmother's estate that had never quite been fully resolved. She said, "Your brother is in some financial trouble." I waited. She said he had made some investments that hadn't worked out and he had some debt and the situation was serious. She said she and my father had talked about it. They still talked, apparently, when it came to my brother, and they had decided that the best solution would be for my brother to come to Asheville and take over the bakery. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. She said they weren't asking me to give it to him outright. They would work something out. Maybe I could stay on in some capacity, help him get oriented, but he needed something stable, something with a foundation already built, and the bakery was the obvious answer. I said, "You want me to give my brother the business I built?" She said, "We want the family to help each other." I said, "He got a house?" She said, "That's not the point." I said, "Where did the house go?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he had taken out a loan against it and there had been some complications. So the house was gone too, and now they wanted the bakery. I looked at my mother across the table. I had loved this woman. I still loved her. But I also knew, sitting there, that the thing she was asking me to do was not really about my brother. It was about a pattern that had started long before my grandmother died. A pattern in which my brother's failures were understood as temporary setbacks requiring family support, and my efforts were understood as resources available to be redistributed. I said, "I'm not going to do that." She said she thought I should take some time to think about it. I said I didn't need time. She said that family took care of each other. I said that was true, and asked her to remind me who had helped me move to Asheville, who had helped me make the first $4,000 payment on my pastry course, who had called to ask how the first week went, or the first month, or the first year, who had shown up when I was sleeping on an air mattress and waking up at 4 in the morning and teaching myself to bake in an oven that sounded like it was about to take off. She didn't answer any of those questions. She said my brother was her son. I said I knew that. I said I was her daughter, and that I had built this, and that I was not going to hand it to someone who had never expressed a single moment of interest in it. She left that evening without finishing her coffee. My brother called 2 days later. He was more direct than my mother. He said he knew the situation, he knew there had been a conversation, and he wanted to talk about it like adults. He said he'd had a rough couple of years, that the investments hadn't worked out the way he expected, and that he really felt like the bakery could be a fresh start for him. I asked him when he had ever baked anything. He said that wasn't really the point. I said I disagreed. He said he wasn't asking me to hand it over for nothing. He'd buy me out. He'd figure out the financing. I said he had already figured out the financing on a house, and that hadn't gone particularly well. He said that was unfair. I said a lot of things were unfair, and I had made peace with most of them, and this was one I wasn't going to make peace with. He hung up. I sat in the bakery after that call for a long time. It was early morning before Dot, who had not yet retired, who had extended her 2-year timeline twice because she said she wasn't ready, arrived for her shift. The new oven was running its preheat cycle. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Everything I had done was contained in the space and in the contracts and accounts attached to it. I called my lawyer that morning. I had one now, a woman who handled small business matters, who I had started working with when I negotiated the lease expansion. I told her I needed to talk about asset protection, about what it would take to restructure the business in a way that made it very clear, on paper and in law, that this was mine and only mine. We met that week. Over the following month, I restructured the bakery as a single-member LLC with an operating agreement that left no ambiguity, updated my business estate documents, and put everything I built into a structure that would require court intervention, not a phone call from my mother to touch. I didn't tell my family I had done this. My mother called again, about 3 weeks after her visit. She said she hoped I had been thinking. She said my brother's situation was getting more urgent. She said she thought I was being selfish. I said I thought she had a different definition of selfish than I did, and that I was genuinely sorry my brother was struggling, and that I hoped he found a path forward. She asked if that meant I wasn't going to help. I said I wasn't going to give him my business. She said she didn't know how I could live with that. I said I had been living with quite a lot, actually, for the past few years, and I had found it surprisingly manageable. We didn't speak for about 2 months after that. My brother showed up at the bakery on a Saturday morning in February without calling first. The line was out the door. Val was running the catering prep in the back. Dot was at the counter. I was in the kitchen. One of my counter staff came to get me and said there was someone asking for me at the front. I walked out and saw my brother standing at the edge of the line in a jacket that was too light for the weather, looking around at everything with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. I brought him to the back office. He sat down. He looked at the whiteboard where I'd tracked catering bookings. It was full, a solid block of events going out through April. He looked at the framed copy of the magazine write-up I'd hung on the wall. He looked at the desk, which was covered in the organized chaos of a business that was genuinely busy. He said, "You really built this?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a minute. Then he said he'd come because he thought seeing it in person would help him understand why I was doing what I was doing, and that now that he was here he thought he understood. I waited. He said he was sorry. Not a big dramatic apology, just that. He said he should have called when things were going well for me. He said it didn't feel good, the thing he'd been asking me to do. I said I accepted that. I told him I couldn't give him the bakery and that wasn't going to change. But I also told him that I knew Frank, and Frank worked with people who were in financial difficulty and needed to restructure and find a way forward, and that if he wanted, I would make an introduction. I told him that was what I could offer. He took the introduction. I don't know exactly what happened after that. We're not close enough for that kind of detail, and I don't think we will be anytime soon. What I know is that he didn't come back to the bakery asking for anything, and my mother and I found our way back to a version of talking that mostly avoids the subject. Last spring, I signed a lease on a second location. It's in a neighborhood on the other side of Asheville. Same kind of story, overlooked, beginning not to be. The space has good bones. The oven situation is much better this time around. My grandmother's note is still under the register at the original location. I found it when I had the counter refinished, tucked even further under than before, the paper a little more yellowed. I keep it there on purpose. This is yours if you want it. Don't let anyone tell you what it's worth. I knew what it was worth. I just needed a few years to prove it. There's a note still tucked under the register at Mabel's. I leave it there on purpose, even though the counter has been refinished and everything else in that space looks different from what my grandmother knew. The paper is yellowed now, the handwriting is hers. I think about that note a lot, not because it was advice exactly, but because it asked a question. Do you want it? Not can you do it? Not will it be easy? Just, do you want it? Wanting something? Really wanting it turns out to be its own kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom people talk about in commencement speeches, the kind that comes from books and mentors and carefully accumulated experience. Something simpler and harder than that. The willingness to sit on a floor and cry, and then get up and figure out what comes next. I had no idea what I was doing when I walked into that bakery. I had a graphic design degree and a credit card and a lot of fear. What I also had was the honest acknowledgement that I wanted to try, and the integrity to not lie to myself about how much work that was going to take. I think about Frank a lot too. He was not a warm man, not in the way people mean when they use that word. He didn't tell me things were going to be fine. He told me the truth, which was harder to hear and more useful. That's its own kind of care, the kind that respects you enough to not protect you from reality. I try to carry that with me. When I'm making decisions about the business now, I ask myself what I actually know versus what I'm hoping, and I try not to confuse the two. My brother came into that bakery on a Saturday morning when the line was out the door, and I watched something shift in his face. I don't think it was jealousy exactly. I think it was recognition of what sustained effort over time actually produces, which is something you can't fake and can't inherit and can't take from someone else without it falling apart in your hands. He saw it, and I think some part of him understood, in that room, that what my family had been asking me to do wasn't just unfair. It was impossible in a deeper sense. You can't transfer what built a thing. You can only transfer the thing itself, emptied of everything that made it work. I spent a long time being angry about the way things were divided. The house versus the bakery. The asset with obvious value versus the one that required everything I had to make valuable. I don't think I was wrong to be angry. But I also know that the anger was never what moved me forward. What moved me forward was getting up at 4 in the morning when I didn't want to, and learning one more thing I didn't know, and choosing over and over again to stay. That's the part nobody sees when they look at a business that's working. They see the line out the door and the magazine write-up, and the second location with better bones. They don't see the air mattress, the oven that sounded like it was about to take off, the credit card bill, the weeks when I genuinely didn't know if I was making the right call. I knew what the bakery was worth because I was the one who decided what it was worth. That's not arrogance. That's just what it means to build something. You have to believe in its value before anyone else does, and you have to keep believing long enough for the belief to become true. My grandmother understood that. She left me a note instead of an explanation. She trusted me to figure out the rest. I'm still figuring it out. But the door is open, the oven is on, and the line forms early,